Hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me at this conference today. I'm really excited to present this keynote. It does have the longest title ever, How Neuroscience Helps Us to Understand the Importance of Play and Movement in Supporting Healthy Developmental Transitions. Goodness me, we'll come to that. My name's Marina Dickson. I work at the Australian Childhood Foundation, and as has been mentioned, I'm the Executive Manager of Professional Education Services at the Foundation. I want to start this session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet today, and to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I think it's always really important to think about those elders of the future, those emerging elders, and the role that we all play in supporting their development to be strong and wise leaders in their own communities. So I just want to make that acknowledgement as we start the session today. I also just want to briefly talk about the Australian Childhood Foundation. I am aware that you will have met Nikki, some of you, yesterday in a session. She's one of our fabulous team in Tasmania. We're a national not-for-profit organisation, and as it says there, our vision is that all children are safe from the trauma of abuse, violence and neglect. So we work in multiple ways across Australia and in terms of supporting children, young people and those who care for them, be they family members, foster carers, residential carers, and all of those in the child's world. So as much as our focus is in our work is on children who've experienced trauma, abuse and violence, we also focus on healthy child development and what it is that can both support that development initially or repair that development where children have had adverse experiences. And some of that is what I'll draw on for this presentation today. So this title, oh my goodness. So, and I've put here, what on earth is that mouthful about? So I just want to break it down a little bit and say that's what I'll also do for the presentation, is break down some of these key concepts and thinking about what that might mean for you in your work or your care or in your life generally. So I want to start with then neuroscience, which can sound a bit daunting, but really it's the science of the brain and how it connects with the body. So any word that you see that has neuro at the start of it invariably means that it's about the brain. And I think that understanding about how the brain develops, what it needs in terms of brain food to best develop, can really help us in our understanding of children and young people and what it means for us throughout the lifespan as well. So when we're talking about neuroscience, as I say, we'll have a look at the brain. I'm really aware that some of you may have done a lot of study around neuroscience, about neurobiology, perhaps neuroplasticity, for those of you that may be some repetition or reinforcement of learning today, but I'm hoping that in the question and answer session after this presentation, we can delve into things more deeply if you would like. Then when we think about, okay, healthy development, what's that? So really what we want to look at is child development, but adding in that layer of brain development. How does that help us understand children and how they develop and what they need through that developmental sequence? We're really aware that that initial developmental process occurs from in utero and doesn't finish until we're around 25 years old. So what is it that supports that incredibly long period of time and that amazing process of development that happens? And how can we support that at those transition points through that development? And so then we want to look at play and movement and what role does play and movement have in development, in healthy development, and how does it link to our understanding of neuroscience? And so we're really looking at play and movement as strategies in a lot of ways to support development, why they're important, because I know you know they're important and we do it every day, don't we? Anyone working, caring for children will use play on a daily basis and will engage in movement on a daily basis, as we all do. But why is it important? And then finally thinking about transitions and what does that mean? And I know that's the theme of the conference, is looking at transitions. And I want to look at that term broadly because I think there's a range of transitions where we can apply an understanding of neuroscience and the value of play and movement. And whether that's every hour, every day, every week, every year, or every developmental stage, there are things for us to think about in terms of that transitional process. And really, when we think about transitions, we think about change, because really a transition is a change. And how can we utilise our understanding of neuroscience? How can we utilise our understanding of play and movement to support those changes, to support those transitions? So that's really what I want to explore for the next half hour. And as I say, I'll apologise if this is material that you know, but equally I'm really happy to explore it in more detail in the question and answer session that we'll have after this presentation. So I'm going to start with the brain, and I'm quite fascinated around how we're going to talk about neuroscience and neurobiology in half an hour, but let's see how we go. So I put up this picture and I'm going to flick between this picture and some key messages. So I want to keep sort of going between the two, but just to show you the brain, the key thing that we talk about when we're thinking around neuroscience is particularly around this developmental process and the different parts of the brain and their broad functions and how they operate and how they best develop. So I've outlined what the key parts of the brain are. If you're seeing this for the first time, it can look a bit daunting with the language, like what on earth is a cerebellum, a corpus callosum, what the heck is that, diencephalon, there's all sorts of words there. Don't worry too much. That's for people to hang on to. You can take this image away with you. They're the parts of the brain. What I'm more interested in, though, is what does that actually mean for us in our understanding about children and young people and their development. So that's why I want to look at some of these key messages. So the first one is around another neuro word. So it's neurosequential development. So again, if we go back to what I said, neurosequential, the sequence in which the brain develops. Yeah. So the thing about the sequence in which the brain develops is that that's pretty much set. The different parts of the brain develop fully at different times. It doesn't mean that they're not doing anything else all the rest of the time, but what we're talking about is that initial developmental process and the fact that there are different transitions between which part of the brain is doing more development at different ages and stages. And that helps us understand what children need. So when we look at this quite quickly, but hopefully usefully, these key developmental transition points. So the first part of the brain to fully develop is the brainstem. It's right at the bottom. People will know that. And this key time of development is in utero and the first 8 months of life. And the brainstem is responsible for basic bodily functions. It's responsible for keeping us alive, which is why it has to go first. It needs to develop fully to enable us to live, to develop the rest of the brain and the body. So it's really important when we're thinking about development. It sets the rhythm of our lives. It sets the heart rate, our blood pressure, managing body temperature, addressing those basic needs that we have that help keep us alive. The second part of the brain to develop is actually up a bit. It's this diencephalon. And really what it's responsible for then is taking in sensory information from the environment around us and then sending it around the brain to be processed to enable us to survive in our environment. So, for example, it might take in information that this is cold here. And so we need to initiate some physiological responses to enable us to survive in this environment. And so this part of the brain develops very early as well. It it's the first 12 months of life. And when you think about it, what do we offer children in the first 12 months of life? We offer them sensory enrichment, don't we? Everything is about sensory, that we speak to babies in that exaggerated way. We talk about it as parent ease. There's sort of a sing-songy way that we talk to babies. We use exaggerated facial expressions. You do the big eyes when you're looking at the baby, and lots of mirroring where, if they're making a face, we make a face, and we sort of mirror what they're doing. We hold them tightly so they can feel us, so they can smell us, and we provide them with that sort of nurturing food that they learn to, taste and to understand that that's part of their world. So we have this sensory thing that happens within the first 12 months supporting children's development, and it's this part of the brain. So we want that first 12 months to be filled with sensory experiences. The next part of the brain to develop is the cerebellum. So that's the red bit towards the bottom, and it's responsible for movement, but it's not the only part of the brain responsible for movement, but it particularly helps us orient ourselves in space, to help us understand where we are in the world, not bump into things, that sort of thing. And so the first 2 years of life are critical for developing that part of the brain in a healthy way. And when you think about it again, it makes sense. When you think about what can a baby do in terms of movement at the age of 0 when they're born, they can move their hands and feet, they can suck, but that's about it. They can't even hold their own heads up. What can they do by 2? Well, by 2, they're running. Yeah. So there's this extraordinary sort of developmental process that happens. So understanding that is really useful. That first 2 years of life is so important in thinking about movement development. And then we come to this limbic system. So the limbic system is our emotional processing centre. It doesn't give words to emotion, but it takes in all the information from these other lower parts of the brain and the body and helps us to understand, what is this experience? What is my response to this experience? Is it something, for example, that's threatening? Now, in working with children who experience abuse, this is really important. But if we're not working in that field, we understand that equally is this threatening, or is this joyful? Is this pleasurable? Or is this just an everyday experience? I don't really need to react. And it probably comes as no surprise that when we're talking about the important time of development for this part of the brain, it's between 0 and 4. And I say it seems obvious because then you go, okay, so what's smack bang in the middle of 0 to 4? It's 2 to 3. And so it's in tantrum land, that sort of thing. But really, this is about children developing their emotional capacity between 0 and 4. And sometimes they get overwhelmed by their own emotions. The thinking part of their brain hasn't developed fully yet, so they struggle with regulating it. And so they need us to help them to regulate it. And really, that's what the developmental process is about finding this sort of way to manage how they're feeling. And people often focus on tantrums, whereas I say, no. Look at the flip side. Look at joy through the eyes of a 3-year-old, because it's beautiful and it's just as all-encompassing as the tantrum. When they get overwhelmed by a negative emotion, they equally get almost overwhelmed by positive emotion as well. And when they have that joyful experience, like their whole body's in it. It's like, oh, wow, that's so fantastic. I love that. I always think about the first time my children saw sunflowers. They had this amazing joy reaction. And so it helps children if we give them those experiences, particularly in that 0 to 4 age group. And then we look at this last part of the brain to develop, which is the cortex or the neocortex, the thinking part of the brain. And it's particularly associated with language because it's thought-based. So you need language for thoughts. And so when we're talking about this developmental process, it's particularly 2 to 6 as they add in their vocab, as they start to explore the world with language and labels and that sort of thing. And then we also know there's a time of development in adolescence of the front part of the cortex, which is really responsible for that reflective thinking. So that's a really quick journey through that neurosequential developmental sequence, but it's helpful for us to understand that there are these key points of transition even through brain development. And then the other key message is clearly that there's this connection between the brain and the body. It's not like brains are floating in a vacuum. The body gives the brain messages, the brain gives the body messages. There's this constant flow between the two, and that develops and continues to connect and build connections. So that's really important as well. The other thing that we talk about is how important safety is in development, in helping the brain to react. Because if we don't feel safe, our brains can't do all the things they need to do. They have to focus on helping us to feel safe again. And so we would talk about that as focusing on survival rather than thriving. So as we build safety into our thinking about neuroscience and about our relationships with children and how we can provide safety and transition, that helps in terms of healthy development. And the other critical thing that accompanies that is relationships. Brains do not develop in a vacuum, and humans do not develop alone. We need to connect with other human beings to survive. It's fundamental. We know a human infant will not survive if it doesn't form relationships with those around them. So we equate relationships and connection with survival. And so that's why we don't do well when we're isolated, when we're disconnected, and why it's so important that we form these connections and we're able to hold on to those throughout the lifespan, but how important healthy development is in relationship. And that can feel a bit daunting and a bit overwhelming, but I think it then becomes beholden to us to then provide positive relational experiences with all the children that we work with or care for. And that doesn't have to be anything too special, but it's just acknowledging how important relationships are in terms of healthy development and how we can utilise relationship in transition to help kids to navigate changes in their world, because they need someone to help them with that. They need those relationships to navigate change, as do we all. You know, it is that we don't do well by ourselves. And I suppose the last 12 months have told us a lot about that, about how challenging disconnection can be. So the other thing when we're talking about key messages about neurobiology is the importance of repetition. Our brains are a representation of the things we've done the most. So when we're thinking about healthy development, what we want to think about is what is it that we want to provide for our children on a repeated basis so that they become the things that they do the most, and that's what they carry with them into the future. And so healthy development enables healthy development. You know, the more we can provide experiences on a repeated basis that are safe, that are relationally focused, that are linked to those developmental transitions in terms of the different parts of the brain, then it enables more healthy development. And so, you know, when we think about it in terms of transitions, we want to enable healthy development. When we think about it in terms of where things might go wrong or when children experience adversity or abuse or violence, then we have to think about what they might have missed out on developmentally and go back and repair that developmental process so that then we can kind of find the path to healthy development again. So it's really supporting that process as we go along. And Jack Shonkoff, I love this quote because I think it really is just that reminder about how important those early years are in terms of this developmental transition from infancy and early childhood into childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. Because he says that early experiences set either a sturdy or fragile foundation for all that follows. And so it's not saying that we can't repair a fragile foundation, but it says it'd be great if we could set a sturdy foundation for the children, the young people that we work with and care for, by how we navigate this healthy developmental process, incorporating neurobiology. So it's just that reminder as we go through. And so then we go, okay, so if that's what development requires, if those are the aspects of healthy development based on what we know about neuroscience, then how are play and movement involved? So what is it that makes play and movement important? Because we know that it is, but why is it? So I've just tried to put it together in a little table in terms of some of these critical points. So you'll see the first and the last for both play and movement are the same, and that's that it's integrative. So one of the critical things about development is that what we're trying to do is integrate all the parts together, because then they work best. So we don't just want one part of the brain working and that's all that works. We want it all to be working together through this developmental process. Play is integrative. It involves all parts of the brain and the body, and so it enables that sort of developmental process to happen. The same with movement. Movement is integrative, and it's particularly integrative of both sides of the body and both sides of the brain. So as much as I talked about the sequence, the going from bottom to top, of course there's also the development that happens in both sides of the brain. So we talk about that as hemispheric development, because we have two hemispheres. That's why they're called hemispheres. And we want them to be able to really work together as well. So when I go back to my brain, just to be really annoying, I'll go back to the brain development, and there's that bit called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is the biggest bridge between the two hemispheres. So we want that bridge to develop in a healthy way as well. And one of the most convenient ways to develop a healthy corpus callosum initially is through crawling. And that's why crawling is seen as such an important developmental step. And I always go, oh my gosh, there'll be people sitting there going, oh my God, I didn't crawl when I was a baby, like I was a bum shuffler. What does that mean? And it's like, it just means that your brain found a different way to develop both sides. But crawling is the most efficient because it's working both sides of the brain and body in tandem, because we know that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa. So there's this crossover that happens in terms of that hemispheric interaction. So movement is really important because it enables both sides of the brain to work with each other and both sides of the body to work with each other, and that supports that healthy developmental process. When we're thinking about play, then, the other key thing about play is that invariably it's relationally focused, and we know relationships are critical. So that capacity to play alongside or play with is really important in terms of building those relationships. It's not about having to play cooperatively, because that's not possible all the time for all children, but it is about engaging in relationship through the process of play, and how that is so helpful in terms of healthy development and managing some of the challenges that come from transitions. Also, play is fun. So fun enables positive emotional experiences, and that's what we want for kids. We want them to have positive emotional experiences, the fun of play. And we'll look at an example in a sec that also says those positive emotional experiences can have a little element of scary to them, but they're safe within it. So we talk about the fact that play needs to be safety focused. And safety doesn't always mean wrapping kids in cotton wool, not doing anything. It's okay, that fun to be scared kind of experience that's grounded in relationship. So I know that someone's there to pick me up if I fall, literally and figuratively. So we want play to be safety focused, and we want that movement to be safety focused as well. And it's not just around an absence of risk. It's much more around thinking about what is this experience for me physiologically and emotionally. So I know that's a really sort of convoluted way of unpacking play and movement. So I thought how can I explain it further? Let's have a little look at one example. So I thought, all right, let's do an example of something that incorporates play and movement that most people will know, and it's hide and seek. Yeah. So what do we know about hide and seek? So it's integrative. It involves all parts of the brain. If I think about it, the brainstem, how does it involve the brainstem? Because it's interesting that my physiology, my state changes through hide and seek, because I may be running and so my heart rate goes up, and then I hide and I try to be really still and quiet, so my heart rate has to come down. My breathing changes. All of these things are, linked to the brainstem. There's a lot of sensory information that comes through hide and seek, like I'm listening out for either the hider or the seeker, depending on what I'm doing. There's all the vision of what I'm doing. There's the textures that are associated with wherever I hide, and do I really want to put my hand in there to see if someone's in there? So there's all of that. I'm trying to think. So taste. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. It depends on what you're doing while you're playing hide and seek. It might be the one sense that's not associated with this process. So we've got taste. Smell. Yes. Well, so how can you give away your position? Let's not go there. But there's certainly some smells that can be associated with play as well. So you're utilising all the parts of the brain, and then of course there's the movement that goes along with it. So that's the cerebellum, the limbic system. If we think about the emotional responses to an experience of hide and seek, there's all sorts of that. There can be fear around, am I going to get found? Am I not going to get found? There's joy if I don't get found because I'm an awesome hider. There's just happiness around, it's really fun to play this with mum or dad or my friend or my brother or whatever it is. There can be a bit of frustration, if I'm the first one to get found really quickly. So there's all sorts of stuff happening limbically. And then there's the thinking part around my plan for where I'm going to hide, or my plan for where I'm going to look for people, or my ability to count if I'm going to do that. And then if we really take it to the nth degree, the prefrontal cortex, this sort of very highly developed part of the brain, enables me to reflect on the past experience. So I might say, oh, that was really dumb hiding under the table because you could see me. So I'm not going to do that next time. So it involves all parts of the brain, and it's connecting the brain and the body as we move. So we see that integrative side in both play and movement. It's relationally focused, clearly, because you've got the connection between the hider and the seekers, or the hiders and the seeker, whatever it might be. But it's a lovely way of connecting, even though you're separating. So it's sort of got connection and separation and reconnection, which is a lovely metaphor for life, really. It supports that hemispheric interaction because running involves both sides of the body, and then climbing into, onto, under, whatever it might be, requires you to work effectively with both sides of the brain. There's the positive emotional experiences of just playing the game, the joy of finding someone, the joy of not being found, as we've said. So there's lots of happiness and joy that accompanies this experience of play. Physiologically rhythmical. I didn't even talk about that on the previous slide, but what we want to do with our physiology is have it go up and down during the day. And that's really good for us in terms of health. This game incorporates that, if you think about it, and I mentioned it before. Your heart rate goes up when you're running off to hide, and then you have to stop, though, and try and be really quiet and, bring it all down again. And then there's the pouncing on someone when you find them and it goes up again. And so that's that lovely rhythm that happens within our physiology on a daily basis. This is important for all of us to have that sort of rhythmical flow during the day. There's no point just having your heart rate elevated all the time. That's not good for you, but neither is having it really low all the time. You'd need a bit of ebb and flow, and that's really good for our physiology. So we're safety focused as well, because we're feeling safe to be in small confined spaces and with these people. It's an interesting experience about, you know, hiding and will I be found and do I want to be found and is that okay, all that sort of stuff. And then the safe to be scared if you weren't found, because it's really great if you're not, but then you kind of go, oh, but has everyone forgotten about me and no one actually is looking for me anymore? And what does that mean? So then being able to reconnect. So I'm sure you've never thought about hide and seek so deeply before, but I'm hoping it's worth it in terms of pulling together this idea about how play and movement are so integral to our healthy development and from a neurobiological perspective, because then it helps us start to think about, okay, well, how can we apply that in our engagement with children and young people in the everyday. So when we're thinking about this, and I know in the abstract I provided this quote, but I think it's one of those things to remember that we talk about play as being children's work. But Theresa Kestly, who's written a beautiful book about the neurobiology of play and how important it is to emotional well-being, said this: play is a neural exercise or neuronal. It's connected to the brain. And I've never met a child who's able to resist being part of this type of exercise. So it really is putting the fun back into exercise, and that's something we could all live with. But it's that sort of engagement in this developmental process and how it builds those connections within the brain and enables our well-being because it has so many elements to it. And then I just want to go back to safety just as, you know, we start to sort of move towards the close. This comes from a resource that was written by some members of staff at the Australian Childhood Foundation. So, yes, it's a marginal plug, but it's really thinking about safety. And this article is called Realising Deep Safety for Children Who've Experienced Abuse, but it really starts to think about the physiology of safety. And for people that may have done other work and other learning around this, that's grounded in polyvagal theory. Sorry to throw more jargon at you, but for some people that may be a connection. But I just want to read this because it says that safety is more than the absence of risk. At its core, it occurs in relationships which engage the neural circuits, there's that language again, underpinning physiological renewal and growth. It's found in our spontaneous seeking out of proximity with others, connection and relationship, our playfulness and curiosity as we explore intimacy and our attunement to the comfort of others. And it's really about that connection. We find safety in the embodiment of our vulnerability in the heart of a loved one. And so it really tells us about how developmentally we need to feel safe, and within that are elements of play and relationship and connection, and that those together enable healthy development, and that those transition points are the points at which we might feel unsafe, and we need to draw on the elements of safety again to feel that safety, to manage that transition, to manage that change. So that's why I think that concept of safety is equally fundamental. And as I say, it is a marginal plug as well, because I will say you can download that article. We have a lot of free resources available on our website. If you go to that address, there's a whole lot of resources for children and for professionals that are free to download. So I know some people like taking resources away from conferences, and it's a bit hard when we're online, but here's an online library that might be useful for you regardless of your role or your work. So I just wanted to throw that in there. And then as we come towards the end of our conversation and as we move into question and answer, it's going back to that point around, okay, well, how does all of this help us in supporting transitions? And it's really about helping, as I've said, helping to navigate change. But we can utilise play and movement and our understanding of neuroscience to navigate transitions that happen on an hourly basis or even less, that happen each each day, each week, in the term, in a year, or through each life stage. So when we think about it, that hourly transition of activity to activity is sometimes a time of real challenge for children, even just the, getting up, getting ready for school. So we can use our understanding of neuroscience and neurosequential development to help children with that. But equally, we can use play and movement. So we can make a game, of getting up and getting dressed and getting things ticked off, and make our game of, breakfast and getting lunch ready and those sorts of things, and use movement. We can do the, make up a dance to get out of the door and out to the car and that sort of thing. So it helps manage that change. I understand those of you who work with teenagers will be there going, yep, sure, Marina, that's fantastic. So I understand that it's a short period of time to talk about possible strategies and we can't use it for everyone, but there are some principles for adolescents around that, even though you might not be doing the walk to the car dance with your adolescent in the morning. I understand. But then when we think about during each day, there's those transition points from home to school or kinder or care, even for us to work. I often talk to professionals around how important it is to think about those transitions between work and then work to home. It's one of the challenges of working from home is to be able to make that transition. But again, we can use play or we can use movement-based activities to make that transition, and that helps us navigate our day. And that's really important because it is divided and sometimes it can be challenging. And so it's finding ways to utilise, playfulness or movement-based activities. And I think for us, it may be, sitting in the car and taking 10 deep breaths before you go home, before the drive home sort of thing, or even working from home, taking those 10 deep breaths at the end of your last Zoom meeting before you go back to the family and, engage in the evening, whatever it might be. Or it could be doing some stretches or whatever it is. These are the sorts of movement activities, again, that goes back to those principles. They're integrative, they're connecting both sides of the brain, they're safety focused, and they're helping us with that rhythmical up and down that happens during the day. And so then in the week, the transition from weekday to weekend, sorry to throw a downer in as we come towards the end, but child protection practitioners will tell you that the busiest time is a Friday afternoon, because that's often where kids are going, I can't go home because it's the weekend. I can't put up with this anymore. And so they tell someone and then notifications come in. So, of course, we want to respond to that, but thinking about how do we support kids to transition between the weekday and the weekend? What does that look like for them? How can we use play? How can we use movement to support them? It's the same when we think about, school or kinder again or care around navigating changes in term. And then we start to think about, okay, then there are these developmental transitions of moving at the end of the year or during the year if we're moving home or if we're moving schools or whatever it might be. If we're moving from, one counsellor to another counsellor, how do we manage that transition? And we can utilise, again, a playful way of doing that. Can we do a storybook that we can give the new person that comes from our time with the old person? Can we, do a video of a dance, or have we built a special handshake that we're going to use that's just ours, or a silly walk or whatever it might be? So something that engages people in connecting one to the other. And then the big one, life stages in transitioning from one life stage to another is, again, linked back to what we know about neuroscience and how it helps us to understand. So I'm hoping that's useful. It does feel like we've covered a lot of territory in a very short amount of time, but I'm hoping that it's a useful way of thinking about supporting children and bringing our understanding of neuroscience and these concepts of play and movement into the notion of transitions, both small and large, and that we can take that and apply it in multiple ways in our work and in our life and with the children and the young people that we care for. So I'm going to stop talking there, and then I'm going to start talking again, hopefully in answering your questions. But I'm hoping that this has been a useful start in our reflection on this issue. So thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to talking more shortly.
Thank you so much for that, Marina. That was really engaging. Lots and lots of information. We've had people requesting you to be able to share your PowerPoint presentation, and I understand that we've been able to do that on Slack. So if anyone is keen to check out in more detail your presentation, it is there on Slack for the attendees at the conference. But it was brilliant presentation. I've got a comment here from Susanna as we wait for some of those cute questions and answers to come through. And I suppose personally from me as well, I'm still laughing about the commentary around the bum shuffling, because I had one of those who stood up and started running and hasn't stopped, and I now need to take lots of 10 deep breaths regularly during my day. But Susanna has said looking at transitions through a developmental and neurobiological lens can really help parents to have realistic expectations of their child's capacity and understand challenging behaviours. I've found ACF resources extremely helpful in supporting families with understanding their child, especially the many transition a child endures every day. So some lovely feedback there from Susanna. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Yep, thanks, Rachel. So I think, yeah, that's one of the things, you know, it is a bit of a scary experience, I have to say, listening to yourself back. So, and then the magic of television, that, you know, different outfit, amazing. But I think one of the things that I was thinking, oh yeah, I didn't sort of articulate that, is about how often this understanding is something that we all carry with our own professional backgrounds, but often it's about how do you then translate it for other people. So that point around being able to talk to parents about expectations, what's reasonable, what's happening for their child, supporting their understanding, is one way that we often can translate this information, because it is, as much as, yeah, it's full of jargon, it's also full of value, and it helps make sense for parents as well. And I think not just for their children, but even sometimes understanding themselves and what they need too, about why they might react in a particular way when they're playing with their child. You know, it can sometimes be a bit surprising, because they'll go back into patterns of the past, because it kind of pulls them back into that developmental stage and age at which they were playing whatever that game was. And they're kind of going, oh my God, I've stopped being a grown-up, what's going on? But to understand that that's because we carry that with us neurobiologically, and, you know, we carry those patterns of the past with us, and that they can sometimes be activated at times and in ways that are very surprising to us, because it's like, oh, I didn't realize that. So yeah, I think
it can be quite confronting, can't it, for us as parents?
Yeah, that's right, because it is a bit of that, where did that come from? Because so much of the patterns of the past that we carry with us are subconscious. You know, they're carried in the lower parts of the brain, which functions subconsciously or subcortically, as we would talk about. So yeah, I think that's it. And how do we find words to help parents understand what's happening for their child? Because it is really helpful for them, because yeah, as you know, each one is so unique and different, and sometimes hard to understand. So this builds into that understanding.
Yeah, and obviously you're coming to us live today from Victoria. Australian Children's Foundation does so much around the country. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of an idea about how we can utilise some of your other services and be able to actually take what you've learnt, taught us today, and then be able to engage with parents to understand those things better.
Yep, so there's a few ways. So I know I did the plug during the session around the resources, but I always like to be able to say these are free. So I like to be able to offer free things. So there are a lot of resources there, both journal articles, for example, that are freely available for professionals, and there are tools for professionals, but then there's also tools for children. There's activity ideas there, and then different tools. And I suppose one of the sort of series that we developed last year was around some of the issues that presented because of COVID. So, you know, storybooks for children explaining things like why, you know, how do we greet people if we can't hug anymore? Why are people wearing masks? You know, why are things keep changing? You know, there's that sort of you know, we're in lockdown and then we're not, and then we are and then we're not. So, and that's hard enough for adults to understand, much less for children. So again, those are freely available there. In terms of some of the other services, there is a parenting program called Bringing Up Great Kids, and people may know that as well. So that is really about supporting parents in their parenting from that sort of neurobiology of play and movement and relationship perspective. So it kind of focuses on the relationship of parenting rather than the tasks of parenting, which, you know, sometimes can be people's focus. Some of the other therapeutic services are available, and I'm sure Nikki would have talked a lot about what we do in Tasmania. So a lot of our direct services are funded by different governments, but working with children in out-of-home care in particular, children and young people in the youth justice system, as well as those who have experienced family violence. So and certainly we're always happy to consult with people and just have a chat, you know, around looking at some of the issues that are arising for people. There's also a lot of resources for schools as well. So, and there is, sorry, this does sound like a plug, but there is an online sort of learning program as well, a self-paced online learning program called Trauma Responsive Practice in Education. And again, going to the website is the easiest way to access that. There is a cost to that, but we try and keep it as low as possible. So yeah. It's trying to keep costs down. So that's, you know, it's grounded in the work that we do and then trying to translate it into different contexts.
Yeah. And Marina, obviously a lot of the stuff that you've talked about, you know, at face value seems quite common sense, but moving forward, what do you think that the main challenges we're going to find through the childhood sector that we need to look at post-COVID world?
I think it will be, I think there's a few. I think that sort of reconnection, it feels like that's going to be the theme that emerges about people being able to reconnect in ways that are meaningful for them, but also in different ways that I do think, you know, as we do this conference online, that it has sort of it has at the time, it forced people to go online, but now people are sort of saying, well, hey, there are some benefits to being online, but how do we still maintain connection in the online world? And I think that will be the challenge for us moving forward, because it's sort of that trying to define, like, what can we do online and where are the limits of that? Where are the boundaries that say, no, this has to be face-to-face? You know, we need to have that connection. And where do we say, well, hey, we can find a way to re-engage with people in different ways, because it isn't that we're in the same room together, but we're still forming that connection and thinking about how we use movement in that and how we use play. Like, how do you play games online without it being just sitting on a screen and you're each pushing buttons? How do you play games online? You know, that sort of thing as well. So I think that's going to be the challenge moving forward. I think the impact for children, it'll be interesting to see, because I think it will draw on the resources that they hold. So often we see that, you know, well, what we know is more vulnerability doesn't make you more resilient. More vulnerability makes you more vulnerable. And so children who are already vulnerable will continue to experience that vulnerability. So we probably need to intensify our support. Other children will be okay because they have that, you know, they have that capacity and that support. I mean, that's the big one when we talk about resilience, for example. I mean, resilience is really grounded in connection as well. It's that feeling that we have support. Sorry.
No, you're right. A question has popped up and it sort of does relate. It was, how do you actually be able to reach rural, disadvantaged and socially isolated children and families given all of these COVID restrictions?
Yeah. And I think this is where we start to see there actually are some benefits to online, that if we can get to, you know, if children do have access to the online environment, I think that's the first thing though, that it does enable us to work with them. It's been, I suppose, and sorry, three thoughts at once. The first thought was that finding a way to work online effectively is a challenge for professionals as much as it is how we engage with the children and young people. But we can find those ways, and that will help us reach. I think it will expand our reach. And it will also expand our reach for supporting those in those communities that support children and young people as well. That was the second thought that came into my head, because one of the things that people have said in ACF offering training all online last year was this was really helpful and I could never have come to it if it was face to face. So it offers that opportunity to support those who support the children as well, and, you know, increase their capability and their capacity in a way that they might not have been able to access previously. And then the third thought that came into my head was also in our experience of delivering counselling services online during this period has been, we have seen some children and young people have actually engaged more when it's been online than they did when they were coming into our counselling rooms. We have some have disengaged, but others have found it that it felt safer, I think, is the experience. So I think it's being able to offer that range for people, and how do we do that? And that I still, you know, it's still not about not doing outreach. I think that's the thing for some of the rural and remote communities and disadvantaged communities. It's still advocating to say, well, it's not just about putting everything online. It's still saying, no, there is some benefit to that face-to-face connection for some people, and we want to advocate for that as much as supporting some of the other options.
Yeah. One of our attendees today has asked, is online possibly a good option for children of parents who have been in a domestic violence relationship, providing it doesn't breach any protection orders?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes, but, you know, because it's hard to make a blanket statement. I think one of the other challenges we've seen in providing counselling online is around issues of privacy, and, you know, that if the child is in the home, how do we help them to feel safe in the home in that counselling environment, whereas it might be normally they come into a room and their parent is waiting outside for them, and it gives them that sense that this is their space and their time. So I suppose I sort of put that into the mix, that I think it does provide some opportunities, but there are also some challenges to think about in terms of maintaining privacy and confidentiality for the child as the client, as much as for the parents as well. So it can work, but you're right, there's also that consideration around orders in place and, of course, not wanting to breach that. But I think that does provide opportunities that aren't there if we're trying to bring people into the same space, because we can't. So I think it provides an interesting option. And for me, that's the thing. I think what this has done is kind of forced us all to look at options. And now is the time where we can evaluate those options and say, when does this work? When does this not work? And what is there another option somewhere in the middle, you know, that we need to sort of consider.
Well, some lovely feedbacks just popped up from Deborah, who says that you've been a breath of fresh air. And we actually commented too how lovely it was to listen to your beautiful, engaging voice. She asks, do you have evidence-based remote learning material that you'd be able to share?
Oh, evidence-based remote learning. I think the short answer is no, but I'll look. So nothing springs.
Take that one on notice.
Yes, that's what you do, isn't it? Can I take that offline? So. Yes. Nothing springs to mind, because I think it's an emerging area. So when we talk about evidence-based, it's tricky, because I think we're still building the evidence at the moment, because we've kind of had to. So there's not a lot out there that I know of. But then I sort of always say, you know, all the people that are out there today will probably be going, oh, I know this thing, I know this thing. So please feel free to share if you do know of anything. But I think
Yeah.
it's an
And just
emerging
finally, because we are running out of time,
Yeah.
last question, what can organisations do differently to engage with parents and children that need support?
See, I always say I'm not sure if it's different or if it's just reinforcing things that we already know work. Because I think a lot of the work from a neurobiological perspective is often the things that we do automatically, and we think they're automatic because they're lower parts of the brain, and we kind of go, oh, you know, I was just going on this, flying by the seat of my pants, I'm just going with the flow, you know, we'll say things like that. Whereas I think what neurobiology does is it gives you that validation and reinforcement of, oh, so that's why that works. And now what I want to do is actually reinforce it and do it more often. So it's not about necessarily doing different. It's about doing it more often, because we know repetition is really important. So that safety focused relational focus is really critical. And how can we apply that? And probably organisations are already doing that, but you need to do it more, because that's what people need. And I suppose the only other thing is to do what you say, not just say what you say. Because I think, you know, if people, the professionals within an organisation don't feel safe and aren't connected, it's very hard to then provide that to the people that come through the door or come into the service in any way. So I think making sure that there's congruence between, you know, what you do in the work and what you do within the organisation internally is really important as well. So yeah, I'm not sure that answers the question.
No, thank you so much for that, Marina. There's a bit of conversation still happening. If you do have any other questions and want to communicate with your fellow attendees at the conference, head over onto Slack, because the conversation can continue there. But a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Marina, for joining us today. We appreciate your time that you've given us.
Not a worry. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day. Well done. It's all beautiful.